Hi, everybody. I'm going to be talking about, Sanity Image API stuff, specifically through a little bit of a lens of using React and creating kind of performant experiences using images on the web. So if you're looking at this from a mobile angle, you'll probably still pick up some things, but this is very much a web-focused sort of presentation here. As the subtext here may imply, there's some tricks and stuff to make some of this easy. So if as you start looking through this, it starts to seem like there's a lot to do and overwhelming, hang in there. We're going to make it really easy by the end. So, and just a very quick intro. I'm Corey. I'm a mostly freelance, front end, full stack, web oriented engineer with a whole bunch of experience. I've done a bunch of stuff for a lot of cool clients and stuff. So you can look me up on Twitter and most other platforms is just at Corey Ward. So, and if you want to get in touch with me, I'm on the Sanity Slack as well. So let's dive into this. So, first of all, kind of want to just like ground rules here. What are we looking to do with images on the web? Like, what are we looking for as far as performance goes? Like, really kind of boil down. It's really just these three things. We want our images to obviously appear, not muddy, not low res, not pixelated. They should look great. We want them fast. We don't want people waiting around for images to load. And we want to not be wasteful of like other resources. So we don't want to do things that slow down the page or that delay other assets. We don't want to waste somebody's bandwidth, especially if they're on like a pay-as-you-go sort of bandwidth plan. So kind of some basic stuff, but how do we actually achieve these three sort of points? So at a glance, I kind of bucketed it out into these handful of sort of things we're thinking about. So, images that look good need to necessarily be like the correct resolution. They need to be, the right format. You're not going to get a good looking photo in a GIF or GIF. You're not going to want to wait around for images, so they need to be, small file size. They need to load at the right time. Hint, hint. That might look like lazy loading. As far as not being wasteful of other resources, we don't want to have additional information in our requests. We don't want to have to keep fetching images on every page. So we want to use caching, these sorts of things. So a lot of kind of basics in here, but when you start listing it out, it actually stacks up to quite a lot of various sort of like things to think about as you work on images. So if we really break it down even more, how do we achieve these things? How do we get fast images? How do we make sure they're the right resolution? They really start to stack up. We need our images to match the size that they're displayed at. That's a little harder these days where, there's so many different device sizes, our CSS has the page changing, and, devices are sometimes high DPI. There's a lot to think about just within, getting the right size image. There's next generation image formats, things like WebP or AVIF, that are only partially supported. They're kind of advanced codecs that, that allow us to compress images more or work particularly well with certain types of images. I think WebP is the only one we'll really talk about today. Compression, we can use lossy sort of image compression. Make sure that we're serving images from, close to the user so they don't have long requests, all the way across the globe to fetch an image. And it just keeps going. So a little dizzy eyes emoji here, I think kind of expresses what I think of when I like look at this wall of text, and this is very abbreviated. So there's a lot to think about. But that's kind of like what we're working with. That's what we're trying to do. So let's kind of like take a break from that and turn our attention to specifically like images and Sanity. So first of all, let's look at what happens when you upload an image to the Sanity studio, right? So you grab this cute image of Gus, your little munchkin kitty, and you upload it to Sanity. So obviously they take that image and they store it and make it available, but you also have this document that people aren't maybe always looking at in the studio, that has this type of like sanity.image asset, and it has this ID. And we kind of tend to think of IDs in the studio or document IDs as kind of opaque things, they're just random. They don't really mean anything, but images are a little bit different. So this image ID actually has a lot of useful information in it that we can use when we start wanting to display our image. Kind of zooming in on it here, we can like break it down into these four parts. So there's this little image part. There's the actual like unique ID for this image. There's the original size of that image, and then the original format of the image. So this can do a whole bunch of things for us. For example, it's really useful to know if an image is in bitmap type data format, like a JPEG or a PNG, or if it's a vector format, like SVG. For example, I would not want to try to resize an SVG image using like the Image API. I would probably just want to hand it directly to the user. But this also lets us sort of determine how big the image was originally. We don't want to scale images up because this is wasteful of data. So there's a lot of useful information in here. And it just so happens that these are all the three parts we need to actually form a URL to request that image from the Sanity Image API. So if you've ever used images from Sanity, on the web or mobile app or something, you've probably seen this. And you can actually fetch this information through the Sanity, like through Grok. You just grab that URL straight from the image when you're querying and just pass on it straight to what you're doing. And you know what? That actually works. You could just jam that into like an image source tag or something equivalent on mobile, and voila, the image loads. There you go. This is kind of good for this has a number of elements. If we look back to our original list here, performance-wise, that check out. It's on the CDN. It's using HTTP3 thanks to the Google CDN. There's no cookie headers. There's none of that extra data. But there's a lot of stuff that we still are not doing to make this image really performant. We're obviously not resizing it all. We're not making sure it's lazy loaded. We're not making sure we're avoiding cumulative layout shift issues as the page loads. So there's definitely some work to do here. There's all of these things can be addressed through the Sanity Image API as well as your markup on your page. And we can look into doing all that, but I don't really have time to go super into depth. But suffice to say, if we look back at this URL here for the image, there's no query string. And the Sanity CDN here supports more than just loading the static file. You can actually pass a slew of different parameters from width and height and quality, formatting. You can change the rotation. You can flip images. You can do grayscale conversions. There's all sorts of stuff that you can do using the Image API. And a lot of people do that with the image URL library. What I'm going to show you next is actually a way to do this that is even easier, I feel like. And that is using a new library called Sanity Image. It's based on an older library I've been working on for years and maintaining for years called Gatsby Plugin Sanity Image. This is a non-Gatsby specific version of it that's just for any React application that lets you utilize get the same benefits. So taking a quick look at what rendering an image using this library looks like instead of just static HTML here. Effectively, we're just importing this. We need to create a builder, which is just really configuring Sanity to tell it what the project ID and data set are. So those go in that URL. And from there, we just render out this Sanity image component. So we pass in the image ID here because, again, that has all that information that we really need to be able to construct that URL. And then we say, hey, this is the width that we want for this image, 500 pixels in this case. Now, this will render just a pretty generic image tag, but it gives us both a source image for that original or standard image at 500 pixels wide using that Sanity Image API. It also renders a source set, so that is going to be a list of other versions of that photo or image, in this case a photo, that are at various multiples of that 500 pixels. So some quite a bit smaller. One, I think that's 2x. So we have a nice range of images based on that original size. So in this case, we say, we know we want to display this at 500 pixels, and I've forgone actually including the CSS styles to do something like that here just for brevity. But we said, okay, we want this to render at 500 pixels. So I want to load an image at 500 pixels, but I want these other options depending on the size of somebody's device or if they have a high DPI screen, this sort of thing. You'll also notice in here, it's included a loading attribute set to lazy by default. So for most of the images on your page, they're going to be below the fold, and we don't need to load those right away at runtime or at the page load time. Sometimes somebody might find the link that they're looking for pretty quickly and just click through, and they'll never scroll down and get to that point. Other times there's just maybe, we have a long list of blog posts with like cover art, and scrolling through 100 of those, we don't need to have all those images right away. We can kind of load them as the user scrolls. So by setting loading lazy, it tells the browser, don't worry about loading this until it's going to actually be used. And browsers do this natively now, so there's no need for additional JavaScript to support that. And we have like an alt attribute here. Always good to do that for accessibility. So this actually like does a bit more. It gets us a little bit closer to our goal. So let's actually take a look at what this does or doesn't do. So in addition to our base sort of options here on the or basic list of like benefits on the left, we also now have it's responsive, it's compressed, because each of those URLs, go back here, automatically have with the Sanity Image library, are going to have like the quality set to like 70% or 75%. And so that's using lossy compression. It's automatically opting in to use like the WebP formatting for browsers that support it. And it will also set like a fit mode, but we're not going to talk about that for the moment. No, my slides aren't advancing. Okay. So we have images now in WebP format, so those are going to be more efficient for the user, and we have lazy loading. So already like fairly simple code here that we're using here, just a handful of lines, and we're getting a lot of the benefits that we were looking for to serve our users' performant images. So there's a couple remaining elements here to take care of. One, we want to make sure that images are loaded using at the right size. So that means the browser needs to figure out which of the images from that source set to load, and it needs to have us help it out a little bit. Otherwise, it has to load like the largest possible image, or assume that an image is going to just be displayed at 100% of the viewport size, which is very frequently not the case, especially on larger screens. So that can be very inefficient. We also don't have any width or height attributes. I'm sure a lot of you are like, yep, definitely need those, and you know why. But for people who don't, you can definitely dig into this, look up like cumulative layout shift and images. Basically, when the browser's loading the image, it needs to know how large of a space to hold on the page until that image is loaded, and it knows the aspect ratio. So you can see this if you have a website with a lot of images and they're all slow and they're all kind of right there. They'll kind of like progressively load in and push everything down. Every time that happens, the browser has to like repaint, and it's a very janky experience for users, especially if they're trying to like click on something and the whole page moves as a result of an image loading. So we want to take care of those. Thankfully, they're pretty easy to do. We just add these two new attributes or props to pass to our Sanity image component. One is sizes. This is the same as the actual image tag would use, because we're really just rendering an image tag out from here anyway. So in this case, we assume that the image is going to be 100% the width of the viewport up until the viewport is 500 pixels wide or greater, at which time we're just going to show the image at 500 pixels. So pretty simple sort of CSS here, I imagine. And just as an example, the other thing is we're not passing width or height separate like props. This first width prop is not being used to actually set that on the image element, because our image might be, we need the height as well, and we don't want to have our code tied into a very specific aspect ratio in many cases. So what we do is just tell Sanity Image that we would like to, say, we said aspect ratio true, and it will determine based on the width and height and the original width and height of the image, any crop values that are maybe being passed in, foreshadowing there. It'll determine what the actual aspect ratio of the image is expected to be coming back from the Sanity Image API, and set a width and height attribute on that image tag that align with what we're looking for. So this code winds up rendering out something like this, where we see that sizes is passed through untouched, and now we have width and height attributes on our image. So, and this is based on an image that was, I think, 900 by 600 as the original aspect ratio. So in this case, we're rendering at 500 pixels, and so our width and height are actually scaled down, maintaining that aspect ratio. Now you'll still want to set the CSS on your image correctly and make sure you're sizing your image using your CSS. This is really primarily to hold the space for that image as the image loads, to avoid that cumulative layout shift. So with this set, we actually were able to check off all of our original boxes. We get performant images. It's not super painful to do, and there's a lot of ways of actually sort of making this a little bit easier to do. They're out of the scope of this talk, just like sort of reusing structures. But yeah, we now have lazy loaded images. They're compressed. We're using good formats. We have the width and height attributes, on and on. So that's really great. And we could leave it there, but there's some additional stuff that the Sanity Image Library does that we would kind of like to take advantage of if possible. So first off, looking at Hotspot and crop. Hotspot and crop allow you, like in the Sanity Studio, one, crop your image. That's straightforward enough, but also set a hotspot, which is like a point in the image where you say, like, that's really what we want the focal point to be. So in the case that we have to crop this image in a way that you don't see the full image, we want to know where we should focus. If the subject of the image is, in the top left, we don't want to crop off the top left equally with the bottom right. We want to kind of crop off the bottom right more to really show that top left. So you can set your hotspot in the Sanity Studio, but from there you actually need to figure out how to handle your image URL, or you don't. You just use Sanity Image, and this kind of handles a lot of that for you. This is especially useful in a case where you want to use a particular aspect ratio for the output. So your CSS might say something like object fit contain or object fit cover, really, on that image in your CSS, and the Sanity Image Library will automatically use object position for that if you pass the hotspot through to it. So it can actually you're all set up so that the browser will automatically hide the right pixels and show the right pixels on your image based on that. And if you pass the crop value through as well, your image will be cropped by the Sanity Image API, which is really handy. You're not sending that actual image data that's not shown. This is especially like if you upload really large images in the studio and you crop into a much smaller area, you don't want to be sending that whole image down to the browser. Again, we're just wasting resources. So this Sanity Image Library supports passing all of those through, and it will do the right thing 99% of the time. And if you have an issue where it doesn't, please let me know. And then there's one other sort of bonus here from people who have used like the Gatsby Image Library, or I think Next Image does this as well, and there's plenty of others. You've seen a very common sort of approach where you have like a low quality image preview that then blurs up as the user sort of scrolls down to it or sees it. So Sanity Image does something very similar, but it is very extra lightweight and it's pretty easy to configure. If we look back to the original data that Sanity has on an image, one of the many attributes that they compute here is the LQIP property under the metadata, and that's low quality image preview. It's a base 64 encoded string, which means it's safe to put it directly in an image source attribute, an SRC. So you can pass that through, and it's a very small image. I think it's something like maybe 10 pixels wide. That will just be like your image resized down really, really small. So it's not a lot of data, and it can be included directly in the source. So when the page loads, that image is already there. There's not another request that needs to be made. So if you pass this along to the Sanity Image Library, it will be included as like the original image, and it will automatically hide once the full version of that image is loaded. I'm also working on some support for blur hashes for those of you who are curious to play with that. Although I'm not convinced that there's a whole lot of benefit in the case where we're rendering it out as either an image or CSS anyways, but support for that is coming, and Sanity already has support for that, and they're generating that blur hash. So if you're using another approach, that's something that's kind of cool with the Sanity Image Library, or with Sanity's Image API rather. So I think that's all as far as this sort of overall presentation goes. I hope I did okay on time. But yeah, so if there are any other questions on this, I know I ran through it pretty quickly. Please let me know. And I guess one other final thing, I'll be working on documenting this library a little bit better and publishing a sort of stable version over the next few days or the weekend. It'll be available for use, although technically it is viable to use it now. It's just kind of in an alpha state with poor documentation.
Awesome. Good stuff. Okay, so there are a couple questions that came up. One came up earlier about like next and next image, but then you kind of got into next image. But can this completely replace like that image handling? Like, could you be in next and then all of the image handling is with the Sanity image?
Yeah, I think Next Image and like the Sanity Image library take similar approaches in terms of the result that they're creating, and you would probably not try to use them in conjunction with one another. But I think that yeah, you could swap out, ditch either Gatsby Image or Next Image for Sanity Image, and I would suggest doing so. I might not be the most unbiased person on this, but there are a lot of benefits that these sort of framework specific image frameworks aren't able to take advantage of with like the Sanity Image API. So you're not able to get the full richness of it. They don't support hotspot and crop, as far as I'm aware, anyway. And I've definitely checked.
Mm-hmm.
And they require a bunch of additional configuration that doesn't always align, I feel like, with the way I approach building pages out. And they're, so for your source set, making sure that you're the right size. With Gatsby image, I think specifically it couple like in your queries, you're coupling the actual size of your image rendered into like the querying rather than to the actual presentation. So there's some subtle sort of things like that. So I think that if you're using something like that and you're not in love with it, it's worth maybe kicking the tires on Sanity Image, give it a shot just to understand kind of the difference in approach.
Yeah, and it's like super important for like images to like handle them and make sure they're super optimized, but also because you want the speed of your website to be quick. Isn't it like 3 seconds that you have until someone like clicks away from your site? So it's like you don't really have a lot of time. So yeah, optimizing is, and then the hotspot and crop is like my favorite thing with Sanity Images. We had another question. Can we edit the behavior of how LQIPs are rendered, blurred versus pixelated?
Um, so it's kind of an interesting question. So the way that they work right now, that data is not touched. It's just passed through to a second image tag that's rendered adjacent to the first with the same styles and such. So in theory, you could pass in a normal URL. You could pass in whatever base64 encoded data you want. You could pass in, a blur hash converted to base64. So yeah, you could do kind of whatever you wanted. There's no additional CSS being used to like use like a blur style. We're
Mm-hmm.
really just kind of rendering that image and letting the browser do the interpolation and resampling to show it at the same size as your final image, as much as we can. So yes, in theory you can. There's no JavaScript that's being used or CSS trickery to fade between the two. That is something
Mm-hmm.
that some people have requested with Gatsby plugin Sanity Image in the past. It's something we might support in the future here, and you might actually be able to do it with the way that I've written Sanity Image now by replacing by specifying a separate component other than a generic image tag and using something like frame or motion. But yeah, that's kind of getting a little bit into the weeds. But
Yeah.
I think yes, for the question itself, yeah, you could potentially use like a different image if you weren't thrilled with the one that you're getting by default.
Yeah. Cool. And you said like a couple more days till it's like out in
Yeah,
the
the
world?
library's already really largely built and
Mm.
it's functioning. I need to write some documentation and I want to make sure that the ergonomics are a little bit easier than they are right now
Mm.
to simplify. But yeah, so not a whole lot of work left. So it should be available soon. And if you go over to like GitHub/Corey Ward/sanity dash image, you can actually, take a peek at the code and kind of how it works today. And the documentation is primarily the same as Gatsby plugin Sanity Image. So if you wanted to give it a whirl now, you can. One benefit over Gatsby plugin Sanity Image is that this is written in TypeScript, so helpful like type support and
Mm-hmm.
good like inline comments and stuff. So hopefully that makes things a bit easier.
Right on. Cool. Well, a lot of great info. Super excited for this, I guess, in a couple of days, but I guess it's kind of already out. So definitely check it out. We'll put the link in the chat. I'll go find it and we'll put it in the chat. But yeah, thank you, Corey, and great talk. Great new Sanity Image package. We're very excited for it. So yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely.